As we're starting our stats unit, we are going to focus on how to analyze data. What do all these numbers tell us? So we're going to start with some data values that you should be familiar with. The mean, of course, is the average of the data values. And when you are analyzing data, you would use the mean when the data set is pretty similar to one another. The median is the middle data value when they're organized in order, smallest to greatest. And you would use the median if the data set is different from one another. That's what this word vary means. If the data set is different from one another, they're not similar. Or if it has an outlier. And if you scroll down, you'll see we have outlier defined at the bottom here. An outlier is a data value that really doesn't fit with the data set. It's a lot larger or a lot smaller, and there was probably something going on when we were collecting data that got us this outlier. So we'd use the median to talk about the data set if it has an outlier. The mode is sometimes classified as a measure of center. That's our next vocab word. But it's really not necessarily a measure of center. It's just the number that occurs most often. So you'll use this for two reasons. One, if the data isn't numeric and you can't calculate a mean or a median, or you're just interested in the most popular answer. So measures of center, mean, median, mode sometimes, they describe in general what the data set tells us. We talked about the outlier, and the last one is our range. You take the highest data value, subtract the lowest data value, and it's what's called a measure of spread because it tells you how varied or different the data set is. So a large range would mean the data set is very different from one another or it has an outlier. And a small range would mean the data set is very similar. So we're going to take a look at analyzing our data. So we've got a set of phone bills from January through June. And first we're going to find the mean, median, and mode. So when you're calculating the mean, which is sometimes represented as, it's called the X bar, that just means the mean, it's a symbol for the mean. Make sure that you remember to use parentheses when you're punching this in your calculator. You need to add all of the data values before you divide. So what you want to do once you calculate your mean is make sure that it makes sense. Because if you get a mean of, for this data set, if you got a mean of 100, it's bigger than any of the data sets. You probably added them all up and then just divided that last one by 6. You probably forgot your parentheses. So it's very important when you're looking at data that you make sure that your answer makes sense for the data set. So when I calculated this, I got a mean of $35. So you look at the data set and you're like, yeah, that kind of seems like typically what the bill was each month was around $35, give or take. Median, you're going to want to line up all of those data values in order. And the median is the data value that is in the middle of the data set. The median is easy to find when we have an odd number of data values. But in this case, we have an even number of data values, and our middle is right here, halfway between the third and fourth data values. So if you look over here at our steps, it's the average of the middle two if you have an even number of data values. So for a median, I'm going to take 32 plus 35 in parentheses and divide it by 2. And that'll give me 33.50. Since we're talking about money, I would put it with that extra 0 on the end to talk about the money. And finally, we're looking for our mode. That's just the number that occurs most often. So as we look through our data set, we had a $35 bill twice. All of the other bills only occurred once. So that's our mode. Now we're going to take a look at analyzing the data based on which value, the mean, the median, or the mode, do we think best represents the data set and why. Now, because two of our data values, both the mean and the mode, ended up being exactly the same, I would say that best represents our data set. So I'm going to say the mean and the mode because two data values were exactly the same. Now, if they weren't, looking at the data set, there was one bill that was quite a bit different than the other ones. That $48 bill was quite a bit higher than the rest of the bills. So typically in a data set like this, I would say the median is a better representation of the data because there was one that was kind of off. So in general, a nice $33.50 bill would make more sense if we kind of exclude that $48 one. That kind of threw the mean off. When you've got an outlier, it will affect the mean because you're adding it in with all of the data values. But notice the median, that $48 bill didn't affect it at all because we're only looking at the middle of the data set. So again, when you've got an outlier, when you've got a value that doesn't really match the rest of the data, typically you're going to say the median is a better representation. All right, so now we need the range. That was our highest data value, that was $48, minus the lowest data value. So our range was $19. What information does this tell you about the data? So again, a small range means the data is similar, and a large range means the data is varied or different or spread out. Now for a phone bill, I would say a $19 range is high because phone bills should typically be about the same each month. You use your phone pretty similar amounts each month. So that one $48 bill tells me there was 1 month where you used your phone quite a bit, and then the other months were more, quote, normal. So I would say this is a larger range. It tells us, looking at the data, we know there was one data value that was different. So it tells us that the data is spread out. I'm going to use the word varied. The data is varied. And we also know there was one outlier. So again, that outlier will affect the range because the outlier will always be the largest or the smallest data value in the set, and those are the two that you use to calculate the range. So when you get a large range, it could tell you you have an outlier. And as we've been talking about, identify the outlier. We think it was that $48 bill that was quite a bit different than the rest of them. And we have already talked about the impact this has on the data set. It made the mean larger and the range was larger.